Here we are out in a blooming desert with an LT 5.3. We got all sorts of color out here in the desert. Guys think the desert's boring, but it's really not. This is an LT 5.3 late model JK, and in my opinion, this is one of the best engines that you could put in a JK. It's efficient, fuel efficient. It's got plenty of power with the 10-speed. There's a lot of engines that have more power, but there's not a lot of engines that are overall a better jack of all trades. If you got to do expedition, if you've got to go the distance, this might be the new engine for you. The LS 6 liter is still a great engine, but this is going to give it a run for its money in my opinion. Now, as you can see, this JK's got a lot of stuff on it. Not too happy about these lights blocking the grill, and this doesn't help either, because this is just a ramp to deflect air over the hood. Now, I did have this up to Salt Lake, and it didn't overheat, but it did run a little bit warmer than it should have. We got fusion axles in this one with speed bumps. Looks like we got RCVs. All right, so we got some pretty heavy steel armor, and this 5.3 LT has zero problem pulling it. Let's take a quick look under the hood. You're probably gonna think that this is an LT1. Now, I haven't looked at it yet, but I'm guessing this has an LT1 intake on it. So let's take a look. Yep, LT1 intake, Motec battery tray, Tipton's been turned, typical build, quad header radiator, big transmission cooler, pretty much everything you need for this engine to survive. We are bombing along in the middle of Utah. We are cruising along at 80 miles an hour, which is the speed limit, and this 5.3 has no problem at all holding speed, even on the grades. I ran regular gas in this vehicle on the way up, and now I'm running mid-grade, and as you can see, we got 225 miles on 3/4 of a tank. So my guess is when this thing learns and all the adaptives are set, and maybe we're not running at 80 miles an hour at 6,000 feet, this Jeep will probably get 300 miles to a tank, at least on the highway, maybe not around town. One of the advantages of the 5.3 is that you can run the regular gas. Now, I don't necessarily recommend that you run it on regular gas, because as I've found out, the better grade fuel you run, the more mileage and performance you get. So if you end up paying 10% more for premium gas, you might get 10% further range. The upside of the 5.3 LT is it has plenty of power. A lot of you guys think because it's a smaller displacement engine, it's not going to perform well, but the reality is it's not like an LS. The LT is direct injected, high compression. It has continuous variable valve timing. This vehicle has a 10-speed Type 2 transmission in it. So the end result is this engine acts like a bigger engine than it really is. Remember, we're running 11-to-1 compression. That's higher than the Hemis, that's higher than the LSs, even the LS3, which is about 10.7. If I had to rank the power of the LT 5.3 with a 10-speed, because remember, the smaller the engine, the more important the transmission is. So we're going to go with the 5.3 LT 10-speed, which is basically what we're doing in the shop right now. It's more powerful than the 5.7 Hemis, even the VVTs. It's more powerful than the 6-liter LSs. I would say it's somewhere between the 6-liter LS and the 6.2-liter LS. It's not as powerful as a 6.2 LS3 or a 6.4 Hemi. However, it would surprise you. This LT 5.3 has a lot of bottom-end torque. So when you drive it compared to, let's say, an older generation LS or Hemi, it doesn't feel like a small engine. It feels like the larger cubic inch engines because of the diesel-like characteristics. And that means that it has some of the advantages of the larger displacement engine. Like right now, we're cruising about 80 miles an hour. We're going up a grade, and we have a significant headwind blowing us around. And we're still staying in 10th gear at just over 2,000 RPM. You're not going to do that with an LS 5.3. You're not going to do that with a Pentastar, not even an 8-speed Pentastar. What you get with an LT 5.3 is the advantages of a smaller displacement engine, but some of the advantages of the larger displacement engine, because essentially the higher compression, the continuous variable valve timing, and the direct injection combine to allow this engine to run more like a larger displacement engine. But you're still getting the benefits of the smaller displacement engine. The LT 5.3 came out in about 2014. We did a few of them with the 6-speed transmission. but I gotta say, it wasn't ideal. The LT 5.3 really wanted more gears. Like the LS 5.3 with a 6-speed transmission, they drove just fine. But once the 8-speed came out, it was pretty apparent that adding a couple of more gears to that smaller displacement engine made a difference. And of course, when the 10-speed came out, that became the ideal transmission for the LT 5.3. Now, you don't want to get a 14 through 16 if possible. They had the earlier 4-wire fuel pressure sensor, a different operating system. They made some improvements, both hardware and software, between 14 and 16. And by 17, they really nailed the LT 5.3. The same thing that happened with the LS back in 7, 8, and 9. By 2010, they had everything worked out. They went to a 3-wire fuel pressure sensor, or rail pressure sensor, should I say. And even though I had one less wire, it had a lot more information because it was a serial network with the engine control module. But they also upgraded the active fuel management and some other things. And as far as I know, the early 5.3s only came equipped with a 6-speed. Once they got the 8-speed and then the 10-speed, they really started to shine. So you have to think about this as a powertrain, not just an engine. Taking like an LS3 and putting a 5-speed Chrysler transmission behind it, or even an 8-speed Chrysler transmission behind it, does not have the advantages of running an OE powertrain with a 10-speed, because everything is dialed in to each other. And what you end up getting is OE reliability, performance, diagnostics, emissions. We could talk all day about all the advantages of going OE and running a high gear transmission. The end result for me is I can drive this highway to 15 and 80 miles an hour at 6,000 feet climbing these grades in comfort. I don't have to worry about being in the slow lane while everybody else blows by me going 80 miles an hour. And that's exactly what happened in 2008-9 when I got my 2009 Rubicon. I was actually going up this highway towards Utah, and I could barely hold 70, 75 miles an hour up some of these grades, and the engine was revving, and it was just terrible. And that was the inception of Motec. With this LT 5.3, it's not like that at all. You're cruising along in comfort. If you go from 10th to 9th, which you tend to do with the LT 5.3, you barely notice it. The tachometer needle moves just a little bit. With a 4 or 5-speed 6-cylinder in a JK, that thing downshifts, and you watch that tachometer just rev up to 4,000 or 5,000 RPM, and it's not very comfortable. Let's talk about the LT 5.3 offerings. The first engine we worked with back in about 2016 was the L83. That was the most popular engine. It was basically the standard or base engine in the half-ton pickup line, Silverado Sierras. They did offer a 6-cylinder LT, but the L83 was really what you saw the most. It came equipped with a 6-speed transmission. By 2017, GM did evolve the L83, and they went to the 8-speed. They went to the new operating system with a more sophisticated fuel system. It became a great motor, and for reasons I don't really understand, I think we should be selling more LT 5.3s. We're probably selling one L83 for every 5 6.2 LTs we do. Don't get me wrong, the 6.2 LT is awesome. It's top of the line. Well over 400 horsepower, excellent drivability. I do recommend premium gas in that engine because it's 11.5 to 1. I know on some of the truck motors like the L86, they say that you can run the lower grade fuel, and you can, in my experience, but just expect less performance and less economy. I think as the word gets out, and guys realize what a great motor this LT 5.3 is, because remember, the LS 5.3 in a heavy JK with 40s was not ideal. Yeah, it would pull it a lot better than the V6, but not as good as an LS 6.2. The LT 5.3 kind of bridges that gap. You can run it in the heavier JKs. You can run it at high speed on the highway. With the 10-speed transmission having all that diverse gearing, it'll allow that little motor to get the job done, where the LS 5.3 might struggle a little. Now, I want to say that the cost of the LT 5.3 is a lot less than the 6.2s, and it is less. I'm not going to say a lot less though, just a couple of $1,000s or a few $1,000s, because essentially they're very similar to their bigger brothers. In the used market, you can find the LT 5.3s much more readily at a low price. But we try to use new engines, and the new engine market is pretty tight right now. So you're going to save a few $1,000s over the bigger engines. Now, engines like the LT1 do require additional components. like an external oil cooler and some accessory drive upgrades that the LT 5.3 does not. So you're going to save a little bit of money there too. The LT 5.3 had active fuel management, a 4/8 cylinder mode. It has flex fuel, and it has not only variable valve timing, but continuous variable valve timing. On top of that, it has a dual stage oil pump. So after the LAD3, what we started to see was the LAD4. But before I talk about the LAD4, I want to mention the LAD2. Now it's odd that the LAD2 seemed to come after the LAD3, but if you get like a U-Haul truck today and you go out and drive it, you're probably going to get an LAD2. And they're amazingly powerful. I think the LAD2 was rated up to 380 horsepower, which is more than an LS 6.0. But what's amazing is the torque. The torque off the line, you just got to go drive one to see what I'm talking about. I got guys that get out of Hemis and get into an LAD2 and say, it seems to be just as powerful as my 6.4 Hemi. Now it's probably not, it doesn't have the horsepower, but the seat of the pants off the line is pretty amazing with the LAD2, actually all the LTs. And remember, with the 10-speed, we got like a 4.6 first gear. That's really low, and that's helping that little engine perform off the line. So I've read a lot about the LAD2, and nothing makes sense. GM Authority and other releases that I've seen show the LAD2 as having 4-cylinder mode. The LAD2s that we've installed in vehicles don't have 4-cylinder mode. Now, I don't know if that's because GM ran into a production shortage and eliminated them on the engines that we've been purchasing, or if that is the RPO or the production order on these engines. Not having active fuel management means they don't really need to run the dual stage oil pump. So they've eliminated that oil pump solenoid, which simplifies the engine. So now we have essentially a high performance version of the LAD3 with the stripped down LAD2. So these engines can really put power out. You don't have to worry about the AFM. You have the simplicity of a single stage oil pump. Now, I'm not saying it's better than the LAD3. We really haven't had any problems with the LAD3s, the oil system or the AFM, but you just have less concern with the LAD2. The LAD2 did change up the accessory drive. I've heard it was to run a power steering pump, but the engines we got in do not have power steering pump. GM really wanted to step the LT up. And like they did going from the Gen 3 LS to the Gen 4 LS, they stepped up the technology in the new 5.3, which became the LAD4. And then its big brother was the LAD7. So they kind of replaced the LAD3 and the LAD6. What did they do? Well, they kept the basics, but instead of having active fuel management that was a 4/8 cylinder mode, they went to what they call DFM, or dynamic fuel management. And now these engines can run anywhere from 2 to 8 cylinders. And we did an LAD7, and it's so odd to put along as a 2-cylinder with a 10-speed transmission. But that's what these engines can do. So in GM's attempt to reduce pumping losses and get more efficiency, which directly affected their decision to drop the twin-turbo straight 6, which Chrysler had developed. The GM had developed one too, but they decided that these V8s are so efficient, they can not only outperform the new generation of straight 6, but they have the longevity and reliability of a normally aspirated V8. So with dynamic fuel management, you're basically only running as many cylinders as you need to get the job done. The problem with running more cylinders than you need is what's called pumping losses. You can look at my old videos, we talk about it, but basically it's creating frictional losses that you have to overcome from the larger displacement engine. So the LAD7 didn't just put 8 solenoids for cylinder deactivation in what they call the lifter manifold oil assembly. They got rid of lifter manifold oil assembly and they put the solenoids directly in the block. So they're more effective, they're more efficient. I don't know if they're any quicker, but when this thing switches between cylinders, it's very hard to tell because they can drop cylinders and bring them in very smoothly, so you almost don't notice that it's even happening. A lot of that depends on the exhaust system because the exhaust note changes, but GM does have mufflers that are cylinder displacement friendly. Now, I've had guys that have like the big Escalades and stuff tell me that they feel that the older engines like the LAD3 and the LAD6 outperform the LAD4 and the LAD7. I don't know how true that is. Our LAD7 was just as powerful as an LAD6 from my seat of the pant experience, but I could see where the L83 and the L86 would stay in the 8-cylinder mode longer, so it felt more zippy and peppy. The dynamic fuel management engines tend to drop cylinders, which makes it a little more boggy, and maybe that's what they're perceiving. So GM changed the block, changed the accessory drive, pretty much changed everything on the L84 and the L87. Now they do share enough electronics and architecture to where guys do revert back to the L83 and L86 electronics on the L84 and the L87. But here at Motec we don't like to do that. So we're trying to run the new generation of computers the way they're intended to be run. The newer 10-speeds run the T93 controller, which up until recently was very difficult to support. But now it is supported, and we've been running it for a couple of years. I don't feel there's enough advantage of the L84 and L87 to warrant going with one over an L83 or L86 or LT1 for that matter. But where they do come in is emissions and legality. If you got a 2020 JL or a 2021 Gladiator JT, you're gonna have to have the newer generation of engine. It's just nuts trying to put an LS3 or a hacked LT into a newer vehicle. Every week I get calls from customers. They're in Colorado, they're in Oregon, they're in California, Wisconsin, Massachusetts, and it's getting harder and harder to keep your Jeeps legal. So where the L84 and the L87 come in is because they're current production, we can put them in the newer vehicles. But getting back to the essentials of the L83, in my opinion, you really can't go wrong with this engine. The guy that wants to do expedition, the guy that wants good performance but still have good drivability. Remember, when you start getting a lot of horsepower out of the early LSs or the Hemis, you start getting into the aftermarket engine performance realm with bigger camshafts and higher compression requiring higher grades of fuel and all that. With the LTs, you're kind of getting the best of both worlds. You're getting the power of the higher performance engines of the past, but you're still getting the drivability of a stock engine. So the guy or girl, and yes, we do quite a few conversions for women, who wants good drivability, good power, good economy, this motor is really hard to beat in my opinion. In fact, I think if this engine was installed in the JK, the JL, the JT, it would have been perfect. There would have been no complaints about power, there would have been no complaints about economy, there would have been no complaints about towing, especially like in a JT. These engines can tow a tremendous amount of weight, but unfortunately Chrysler just didn't have this engine in their toolbox. And Chrysler's refusal to update the Hemi really made it obsolete, and now they're replacing it with the straight 6-cylinder. The V8 has a bright future with GM. GM was going to go with a smaller engine, fewer cylinder route, but recently they decided to axe that because the reliability and the power of these V8s can't be overlooked. So they're going to be coming out with a Gen 6 V8. I don't know what displacements they're going to be, I don't know what technology they're going to have, but you can bet if they're better than what we got, they're going to be fantastic engines. And what we got, in my opinion, is pretty darn good. So don't overlook the LT 5.3s. In my opinion, they are the engine that the JK needs. If you have a special circumstance, like you have 43-inch tires, you're running in the sand, you need all that power and torque, then of course step up to a 6.2. If you're just a hot rodder at heart, and you're one of those guys that can't go to sleep thinking, oh, I didn't get the biggest and the best, get the LT 6.2. But if you're a guy like me that just wants to have enough power to get the job done, drive in comfort at the higher speeds, at the higher altitudes, with lower grade fuel, getting pretty decent economy, then I highly recommend you look at this LT 5.3 10-speed. Now, there is one caveat here, and that is, like everything else, it's been getting harder and harder to get these things. We have to keep bouncing around to whatever's available at the time. First it was the L83s, then it was the L82s, and now from what I understand, the L84s and 7s are becoming available in the auction market. So you're just gonna have to check with us at the time and see what's around, but you're not gonna go wrong with any of these engines. We're gonna take this vehicle up to the mountain and we'll see you soon.